Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. What is to be done? Burning questions of our movement. 2. The spontaneity of the masses and the consciousness of the Social Democrats. We have said that our movement, much more extensive and deep than the movement of the 70s, must be inspired with the same devoted determination and energy that inspired the movement at that time. Indeed, no one, we think, has until now doubted that the strength of the present-day movement lies in the awakening of the masses, principally the industrial proletariat, and that its weakness lies in the lack of consciousness and initiative among the revolutionary leaders. However, of late a staggering discovery has been made, which threatens to disestablish all hitherto prevailing views on this question. This discovery was made by Revolutionaries, which in its polemic with Iskra and Sorya did not confine itself to making objections on separate points, but tried to ascribe general disagreements to a more profound cause, to the different appraisals of the relative importance of the spontaneous and consciously methodical element. Revolutionaries formulated its indictment as a belittling of the significance of the objective for the spontaneous element of development. Footnote 1. To this we say, had the polemics with Iskra and Sorya resulted in nothing more than causing Revolutionaries to hit upon these general disagreements, that alone would give us considerable satisfaction. So significant is this thesis, and so clear is the light it sheds on the quintessence of the present-day theoretical and political differences that exist among Russian Social Democrats. For this reason the question of the relation between consciousness and spontaneity is of such enormous general interest, and for this reason the question must be dealt with in great detail. A. The beginning of the spontaneous upsurge. In the previous chapter we pointed out how universally absorbed the educated youth of Russia was in the theories of Marxism in the middle of the 90s. In the same period the strikes that followed the famous St. Petersburg Industrial War of 1896 assumed a similar general character. Their spread over the whole of Russia clearly showed the depth of the newly awakening popular movement, and if we are to speak of the spontaneous element then, of course, it is this strike movement which, first and foremost, must be regarded as spontaneous. But there is spontaneity and spontaneity. Strikes occurred in Russia in the 70s and 60s and even in the first half of the 19th century, and they were accompanied by the spontaneous destruction of machinery, etc. Compared with these revolts, the strikes of the 90s might even be described as conscious. To such an extent do they mark the progress which the working class movement made in that period. This shows that the spontaneous element, in essence, represents nothing more nor less than consciousness in an embryonic form. Even the primitive revolts expressed the awakening of consciousness to a certain extent. The workers were losing their age-long faith in the permanence of the system which oppressed them and began, I shall not say to understand, but to sense the necessity for collective resistance, definitely abandoning their slavish submission to the authorities. But this was, nevertheless, more in the nature of outbursts of desperation and vengeance than of struggle. The strikes of the 90s revealed far greater flashes of consciousness. Definite demands were advanced. The strike was carefully timed. Known cases and instances in other places were discussed, etc. The revolts were simply the resistance of the oppressed, whereas the systematic strikes represented the class struggle in embryo, but only in embryo. Taken by themselves, these strikes were simply trade union struggles, not yet social democratic struggles. They marked the awakening antagonisms between workers and employers, but the workers were not, and could not be, conscious of the irreconcilable antagonism of their interests to the whole of the modern political and social system, i.e., theirs was not yet social democratic consciousness. In this sense, the strikes of the 90s, despite the enormous progress they represented as compared with the revolts, remained the purely spontaneous movement. We have said that there could not have been social democratic consciousness among the workers. It would have to be brought to them from without. The history of all countries shows that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, i.e., the conviction that it is necessary to combine in unions, fight the employers, and strive to compel the government to pass necessary labor legislation, etc. Footnote 2. The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories elaborated by educated representatives of the propertied classes, by intellectuals. By their social status, the founders of modern scientific socialism, Marx and Engels, themselves belonged to the bourgeois intelligentsia. In the very same way, in Russia, the theoretical doctrine of social democracy arose altogether independently of the spontaneous growth of the working class movement. It arose as a natural and inevitable outcome of the development of thought among the revolutionary socialist intelligentsia. In the period under discussion, the middle 90s, this doctrine not only represented the completely formulated program of the Emancipation of Labor group, but had already won over to its side the majority of the revolutionary youth in Russia. Hence, we had both the spontaneous awakening of the working masses, their awakening to conscious life and conscious struggle, and a revolutionary youth, armed with social democratic theory and straining towards the workers. In this connection, it is particularly important to state the oft-forgotten and comparatively little-known fact that, although the early social democrats of that period zealously carried on economic agitation, being guided in this activity by the truly useful indications contained in the pamphlet on agitation, footnote 27, and still in manuscript, they did not regard this as their sole task. On the contrary, from the very beginning they set for Russian social democracy the most far-reaching historical tasks, in general, and the task of overthrowing the autocracy, in particular. Thus, towards the end of 1895, the St. Petersburg group of Social Democrats, which founded the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, prepared the first issue of a newspaper called Revolutionaries. This issue was ready to go to press when it was seized by the gendarmes, on the night of December 8, 1895, in a raid on the house of one of the members of the group, Anatoly Alexievich Vainayi. Footnote 3. So that the first edition of Revolutionaries was not destined to see the light of day. The leading article in this issue, which perhaps 30 years hence some Ruskaya Starina footnote 28 will unearth in the archives of the Department of Police, outlined the historical tasks of the working class in Russia and placed the achievement of political liberty at their head. The issue also contained an article entitled "What are our ministers thinking about?" Footnote 4, which dealt with the crushing of the elementary education committees by the police. In addition, there was some correspondence from St. Petersburg, and from other parts of Russia, e.g., a letter on the massacre of the workers in Yaroslavl gubernia. This first effort, if we are not mistaken, of the Russian Social Democrats of the 90s was not the purely local, or less still, economic, newspaper, but one that aimed to unite the strike movement with the revolutionary movement against the autocracy, and to win over to the side of social democracy all who were oppressed by the policy of reactionary obscurantism. No one in the slightest degree acquainted with the state of the movement at that period could doubt that such a paper would have met with warm response among the workers of the capital and the revolutionary intelligentsia, and would have had a wide circulation. The failure of the enterprise merely showed that the Social Democrats of that period were unable to meet the immediate requirements of the time owing to their lack of revolutionary experience and practical training. this must be said, too, with regard to the Petersburgsky Rabiki Listok footnote 29 and particularly with regard to Rabikaya Gazeta and the Manifesto of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, founded in the spring of 1898. Of course, we would not dream of blaming the Social Democrats of that time for this unpreparedness. But in order to profit from the experience of that movement, and to draw practical lessons from it, we must thoroughly understand the causes and significance of this or that shortcoming. It is therefore highly important to establish the fact that a part, perhaps even a majority of the Social Democrats, active in the period of 1895 to 98, justly considered it possible even then, at the very beginning of the spontaneous movement, to come forward with a most extensive program and a militant tactical line. Footnote 5. Lack of training of the majority of the revolutionaries, an entirely natural phenomenon, could not have roused any particular fears. Once the tasks were correctly defined, once the energy existed for repeated attempts to fulfill them, temporary failures represented only part misfortune. Revolutionary experience and organizational skill are things that can be acquired, provided the desire is there to acquire them, provided the shortcomings are recognized, which in revolutionary activity is more than halfway towards their removal. But what was only part misfortune became full misfortune when this consciousness began to grow dim. It was very much alive among the members of the groups mentioned, when there appeared people and even social democratic organs that were prepared to regard shortcomings as virtues, that even tried to invent the theoretical basis for their slavish cringing before spontaneity. It is time to draw conclusions from this trend, the content of which is incorrectly and too narrowly characterized as economism. b. Owing to spontaneity, Rabikaya himself, before dealing with a literary manifestation of this subservience to spontaneity, we should like to know the following characteristic fact communicated to us from the above-mentioned source, which throws light on the conditions in which the two future conflicting trends in Russian social democracy arose and grew among the comrades working in St. Petersburg. In the beginning of 1897, just prior to their banishment, A. Heavy and several of his comrades attended a private meeting footnote 30 at which old and young members of the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class gathered. The conversation centered chiefly about the question of organization, particularly about the rules for the Workers' Mutual Benefit Fund, which, in their final form, were published in Listok Rabotnika, footnote 31, number 9-10, page 46. Sharp differences immediately showed themselves between the old members, Decembrists, as the St. Petersburg Social Democrats jestingly called them, and several the young members who subsequently took an active part in the work of Rabikaya himself, with a heated discussion ensuing. The young members defended the main principles of the rules in the form in which they were published. The old members contended that the prime necessity was not this, but the consolidation of the League of Struggle into an organization of revolutionaries to which all the various workers' mutual benefit funds, students' propaganda circles, etc., should be subordinated. It goes without saying that the disputing sides far from realized at the time that these disagreements were the beginning of a cleavage. On the contrary, they regarded them as something isolated and casual. But this fact shows that in Russia, too, economism did not arise and spread without a struggle against the old social democrats which the economists of today are apt to forget. And if, in the main, this struggle has not left documentary traces behind it, it is solely because the membership of the circles then functioning underwent such constant change that no continuity was established and, consequently, differences in point of view were not recorded in any documents. The founding of Revolutionaries brought economism to the light of day, but not at one stroke. We must picture to ourselves concretely the conditions for activity and the short-lived character of the majority of the Russian study circles, a thing that is possible only for those who have themselves experienced it, in order to understand how much there was of the fortuitous in the successes and failures of the new trend in various towns, and the length of time during which neither the advocates nor the opponents of the new could make up their minds, and literally had no opportunity of so doing, as to whether this really expressed a distinct trend or merely the lack of training of certain individuals. For example, the first mimeographed copies of Revolutionaries never reached the great majority of Social Democrats, and if we are able to refer to the leading article in the first number, it is only because it was reproduced in an article by the Footnote 32 List-Robotniker, number 9-10, page 47, at CQ, who, of course, did not fail to extol with more zeal than reason the new paper, which was so different from the papers and projects for papers mentioned above. Footnote 6. It is well worth dwelling on this leading article because it brings out in bold relief the entire spirit of Revolutionaries and economism generally. After stating that the arm of the bluecoats, Footnote 7, could never halt the progress of the working class movement, the leading article goes on to say, the virility of the working class movement is due to the fact that the workers themselves are at last taking their fate into their own hands, and out of the hands of the leaders. This fundamental thesis is then developed in greater detail. Actually, the leaders, i.e., the Social Democrats, the organizers of the League of Struggle, were, one might say, torn out of the hands of the workers, Footnote 8, by the police. Yet it is made to appear that the workers were fighting against the leaders and liberated themselves from their yoke. Instead of sounding the call to go forward towards the consolidation of the revolutionary organization and the expansion of political activity, the call was issued for a retreat to the purely trade union struggle. It was announced that the economic basis of the movement is eclipsed by the effort never to forget the political ideal, and that the watchword for the working class movement was struggle for economic conditions. Or, better still, the workers for the workers. It was declared that strike funds far more valuable to the movement than 100 other organizations. Compared this statement made in October 1897 with the polemic between the Decembrists and the young members in the beginning of 1897, etc. Catch words like "we must concentrate, not on the cream of the workers, but on the average mass worker. Politics always obediently follows economics." Footnote 9, etc., etc., became the fashion, exercising an irresistible influence upon the masses of the youth who were attracted to the movement but who, in the majority of cases, were acquainted only with such fragments of Marxism as were expounded in legally appearing publications. Political consciousness was completely overwhelmed by spontaneity. The spontaneity of the Social Democrats who repeated Mr. V.V.'s ideas, the spontaneity of those workers who were carried away by the arguments that a kopeck added to a ruble was worth more than any socialism or politics, and that they must fight, knowing that they are fighting, not for the sake of some future generation, but for themselves and their children. Leader in Revolutionaries, number 1. Phrases like these have always been a favorite weapon of the West European bourgeois, who, in their hatred for socialism, strove like the German Sozialpolitiker Hirsch to transplant English trade unionism to their native soil and to preach to the workers that by engaging in the purely trade union struggle. Footnote 10. They would be fighting for themselves and for their children, and not for some future generations with some future socialism. And now the VVs of Russian social democracy have said about repeating these bourgeois phrases. It is important at this point to know three circumstances that will be useful to our further analysis of contemporary differences. Footnote 11. We emphasize the word contemporary for the benefit of those who may pharisaically shrug their shoulders and say it is easy enough to attack Revolutionaries now. But is not all this ancient history? Mutato nomine dte fabula narrator. Change the name and the tale is about you. Education is our answer to such contemporary Pharisees, whose complete subjection to the ideas of Revolutionaries will be proved further on. Lenin. End of footnote 11. In the first place, the overwhelming of political consciousness by spontaneity, to which we referred above, also took place spontaneously. This may sound like a pun, but, alas, it is the bitter truth. It did not take place as a result of an open struggle between two diametrically opposed points of view, in which one triumphed over the other. It occurred because of the fact that an increasing number of old revolutionaries were torn away by the gendarmes and increasing numbers of young VVs of Russian social democracy appeared on the scene. Everyone who has, I shall not say participated in, but at least breathed the atmosphere of the present-day Russian movement, knows perfectly well that this is precisely the case. And if, nevertheless, we insist strongly that the reader be fully clear on this generally known fact, if we cite, for explicitness, as it were, the facts of the first edition of Rebuke Dialogue and of the polemic between the old and the young at the beginning of 1897, we do this because the people who want their democracy speculate on the ignorance of these facts on the part of the broad public or of a very young generation. We shall return to this point further on. Secondly, in the very first literary expression of economism we observe the exceedingly curious phenomenon highly characteristic for an understanding of all the differences prevailing among present-day social democrats, that the adherents of the labor movement, pure and simple, worshippers of the closest organic contacts Rebuke Dialogues term with the proletarian struggle, opponents of any non-worker intelligentsia, even a socialist intelligentsia, are compelled, in order to defend their positions, to resort to the arguments of the bourgeois pure trade unionists. This shows that from the very outset Revolutionaries began unconsciously to implement the program of the Credo. This shows something Rebuke Dialogue cannot grasp, that all worship of the spontaneity of the working class movement, all belittling of a role of the conscious element, of a role of social democracy, means, quite independently of whether he who belittles that role desires it or not, the strengthening of the influence of bourgeois ideology upon the workers. All those who talk about overrating the importance of ideology, footnote 12, about exaggerating a role of the conscious element, footnote 13, etc., imagine that the labor movement pure and simple can elaborate, and will elaborate, an independent ideology for itself, if only the workers wrest their fate from the hands of the leaders. But this is a profound mistake. To supplement what has been said above, we shall quote the following profoundly true and important words of Karl Kautsky on the new draft program of the Austrian Social Democratic Party. Footnote 14. Many of our revisionist critics believe that Marx asserted that economic development and the class struggle create, not only the conditions for socialist production, but also, and directly, the consciousness KK.S italics of its necessity. And these critics assert that England, the country most highly developed capitalistically, is more remote than any other from this consciousness. Judging by the draft, one might assume that this allegedly orthodox Marxist view, which is thus refuted, was shared by the committee that drafted the Austrian program. In the draft program it is stated the more capitalist development increases the numbers of the proletariat, the more the proletariat is compelled and becomes fit to fight against capitalism. the proletariat becomes conscious of the possibility and of the necessity for socialism. In this connection, socialist consciousness appears to be a necessary and direct result of the proletarian class struggle. But this is absolutely untrue. Of course, socialism, as a doctrine, has its roots in modern economic relationships just as the class struggle of the proletariat has, and, like the latter, emerges from the struggle against the capitalist-created poverty and misery of the masses. But socialism and the class struggle arise side by side and not one out of the other. Each arises under different conditions. Modern socialist consciousness can arise only on the basis of profound scientific knowledge. Indeed, modern economic science is as much a condition for socialist production as, say, modern technology, and the proletariat can create neither the one nor the other, no matter how much it may desire to do so. Both arise out of the modern social process. The vehicle of science is not the proletariat, but the bourgeois intelligentsia. KK.S italics. It was in the minds of individual members of this stratum that modern socialism originated, and it was they who communicated it to the more intellectually developed proletarians who, in their turn, introduced it into the proletarian class struggle where conditions allowed it to be done. Thus, socialist consciousness is something introduced into the proletarian class struggle from without on Ausenheinian Getrations and not something that arose within it spontaneously or outside. Accordingly, the old Hainfeld program quite rightly stated that the task of social democracy is to imbue the proletariat, literally saturate the proletariat with the consciousness of its position and the consciousness of its task. There would be no need for this if consciousness arose of itself from the class struggle. The new draft copied this proposition from the old program, and attached it to the proposition mentioned above. But this completely broke the line of thought, since there can be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement. Footnote 15. This does not mean, of course, that the workers have no part in creating such an ideology. They take part, however, not as workers, but as socialist theoreticians, as Proudhons and Weitlings. In other words, they take part only when they are able, and to the extent that they are able, more or less, to acquire the knowledge of their age and develop that knowledge. But in order that working men may succeed in this more often, every effort must be made to raise the level of the consciousness of the workers in general. It is necessary that the workers do not confine themselves to the artificially restricted limits of literature for workers, but that they learn to an increasing degree to master general literature. It would be even truer to say are not confined, instead of do not confine themselves, because the workers themselves wish to read and to read all that is written for the intelligentsia, and only a few bad intellectuals believe that it is enough for workers to be told a few things about factory conditions and to have repeated to them over and over again what has long been known. Lenin. End of footnote 15. The only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. There is no middle course, for mankind has not created a third ideology, and, moreover, in a society torn by class antagonisms there can never be a non-class or an above-class ideology. Hence, to belittle the socialist ideology in any way, to turn aside from it in the slightest degree, means to strengthen bourgeois ideology. There is much talk of spontaneity, but the spontaneous development of the working class movement leads to its subordination to bourgeois ideology, to its development along the lines of the Credo program, for the spontaneous working class movement is trade unionism, is Nerdgewerkschaftlerie, and trade unionism means the ideological enslavement of the workers by the bourgeoisie. Hence, our task, the task of social democracy, is to combat spontaneity, to divert the working class movement from this spontaneous, trade unionist striving to come under the wing of the bourgeoisie, and to bring it under the wing of revolutionary social democracy. The sentence employed by the authors of the Economist letter published in Iskra, number 12, that the efforts of the most inspired ideologists fail to divert the working class movement from the path that is determined by the interaction of the material elements and the material environment is therefore tantamount to renouncing socialism. If these authors were capable of fearlessly, consistently, and thoroughly considering what they say, as everyone who enters the arena of literary and public activity should be, there would be nothing left for them but to fold their useless arms over their empty breasts and surrender the field of action to the Struves and Prokopoviches, who are dragging the working class movement along the line of least resistance, i.e., along the line of bourgeois trade unionism, or to the Zubatists, who are dragging it along the line of clerical and gendarme ideology. Let us recall the example of Germany. What was the historic service Lassalle rendered to the German working class movement? It was that he diverted that movement from the path of progressionist trade unionism and cooperativism towards which it had been spontaneously moving with the benign assistance of Schultz Delitzsch and his like. To fulfill such a task it was necessary to do something quite different from talking of underrating the spontaneous element, of tactics as process, of the interaction between elements and environment, etc. A fierce struggle against spontaneity was necessary, and only after such a struggle, extending over many years, was it possible, for instance, to convert the working population of Berlin from a bulwark of the Progressionist Party into one of the finest strongholds of social democracy. This struggle is by no means over even today, as might seem to those who learn the history of the German movement from Prokopovich, and its philosophy from Struve. Even now the German working class is, so to speak, split up among a number of ideologies. The section of the workers is organized in Catholic and monarchist trade unions. Another section is organized in the Hirsch-Dunziker Footnote 33 unions, founded by the bourgeois worshippers of English trade unionism. The third is organized in social democratic trade unions. The last named group is immeasurably more numerous than the rest, but the social democratic ideology was able to achieve this superiority, and will be able to maintain it, only in an unswerving struggle against all other ideologies. But why, the reader will ask, does the spontaneous movement, the movement along the line of least resistance, lead to the domination of bourgeois ideology? For the simple reason that bourgeois ideology is far older in origin than socialist ideology, that it is more fully developed, and that it has at its disposal immeasurably more means of dissemination. Footnote 16. It is often said that the working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism. This is perfectly true in the sense that socialist theory reveals the causes of the misery of the working class more profoundly and more correctly than any other theory, and for that reason the workers are able to assimilate it so easily, provided, however, this theory does not itself yield to spontaneity, provided it subordinates spontaneity to itself. Usually this is taken for granted, but it is precisely this which Rabcai-Diallo forgets or distorts. The working class spontaneously gravitates towards socialism. Nevertheless, most widespread and continuously and diversely revived bourgeois ideology spontaneously imposes itself upon the working class to a still greater degree. Lenin. End of footnote 16. And the younger the socialist movement in any given country, the more vigorously it must struggle against all attempts to entrench non-socialist ideology, and the more resolutely the workers must be warned against the bad counselors who shout against overrating the conscious element, etc. The authors of the Economist letter, in unison with Rebecca Diallo, inveigh against the intolerance that is characteristic of the infancy of the movement. To this we replied yes, our movement is indeed in its infancy, and in order that it may grow up faster, it must become imbued with intolerance against those who retard its growth by their subservience to spontaneity. Nothing is so ridiculous and harmful as pretending that we are old hands who have long ago experienced all the decisive stages of the struggle. Thirdly, the first issue of Rebecca's Missal shows that the term economism, which, of course, we do not propose to abandon, since, in one way or another, this designation has already established itself, does not adequately convey the real character of the new trend. Rebecca's Missal does not altogether repudiate the political struggle. The rules for a workers' mutual benefit fund published in its first issue contain a reference to combating the government. Rebecca's Missal believes, however, that politics always obediently follows economics. Rebecca Diallo buries this thesis when it asserts in its program that in Russia more than in any other country, the economic struggle is inseparable from the political struggle. If by politics is meant social democratic politics, then the theses of Rebecca's Missal and Rebecca Diallo are utterly incorrect. The economic struggle of the workers is very often connected, although not inseparably, with bourgeois politics, clerical politics, etc., as we have seen. Rebecca Diallo's theses are correct. If by politics is meant trade union politics, this, the common striving of all workers to secure from the government measures for alleviating the distress to which their condition gives rise, but which do not abolish that condition, i.e., which do not remove the subjection of labor to capital. That striving indeed is common to the English trade unionists, who are hostile to socialism, to the Catholic workers, to the Zubotiv workers, etc. There is politics and politics. Thus, we see that Rebecca's Missal does not so much deny the political struggle, as it bows to its spontaneity, to its unconsciousness. While fully recognizing the political struggle better, the political desires and demands of the workers, which arises spontaneously from the working class movement itself, it absolutely refuses independently to work out a specifically social democratic politics corresponding to the general tasks of socialism and to present-day conditions in Russia. Further on we shall show that Rebecca Diallo commits the same error. See the Self-Emancipation Group Footnote 34 and Rebecca Diallo. We have dealt at such length with the little-known and now almost forgotten leading article in the first issue of Rebecca's Missal because it was the first and most striking expression of that general stream of thought which afterwards emerged into the light of day in innumerable streamlets. I was perfectly right when, in praising the first issue and the leading article of Rebecca's Missal, he said that the article had been written in a sharp and fervent manner. Listock Robotniker, number 9-10, page 49. Every man with convictions who thinks he has something new to say writes fervently and in such a way as to make his views stand out in bold relief. Only those who are accustomed to sitting between two stools lack fervor. Only such people are able to praise the fervor of Rebecca's Missal one day and attack the fervent polemics of its opponents the next. We shall not dwell on the separate supplement to Rebecca's Missal below. We shall have occasion, on various points, to refer to this work, which expresses the ideas of the economist more consistently than any other, but shall briefly mention the appeal of the Self-Emancipation of the Workers Group, March 1899, reprinted in the London Econon, footnote 35, number July 7, 1899. The authors of the appeal rightly say that the workers of Russia are only just awakening, are just beginning to look about them, and are instinctively clutching at the first available means of struggle. Yet they draw from this the same false conclusion as that drawn by Rebecca's Missal, forgetting that the instinctive is the unconscious, the spontaneous to the aid of which socialists must come, that the first available means of struggle will always be, in modern society, the trade union means of struggle, and the first available ideology the bourgeois trade union ideology. Similarly, these authors do not repudiate politics, they merely echo Mr. V.V. that politics is the superstructure, and therefore, political agitation must be the superstructure to the agitation carried on in favor of the economic struggle. It must arise on the basis of this struggle and follow in its wake. As for Revolutionaries, it began its activity with the defense of the economists. It stated a downright untruth in its opening issue number 1, pages 141 to 42, in claiming that it does not know to which young comrades Axelrod referred when he warned the economists in his well-known pamphlet. Footnote 17. In the polemic that flared up with Axelrod and Plekhanov over this untruth, Revolutionaries had to admit that in form of perplexity, it sought to defend all the younger Social Democrats abroad from this unjust accusation, the charge of narrowness leveled by Axelrod at the economists. In reality, this accusation was completely justified, and Revolutionaries knew perfectly well that, among others, it applied also to a member of its editorial board. Let me note in passing that in this polemic Axelrod was entirely right and Revolutionaries entirely wrong in their respective interpretations of my pamphlet The Tasks of the Russian Social Democrats. Footnote 18. The pamphlet was written in 1897, before the appearance of Revolutionaries, when I thought, rightly, that the original tendency of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle, which I characterized above, was dominant, and this tendency was dominant at least until the middle of 1898. Consequently, Revolutionaries had no right whatever, in its attempt to deny the existence and danger of economism, to refer to a pamphlet that expressed views forced out by economist views in St. Petersburg in 1897–98. Footnote 19. But Revolutionaries not only defended the economists, it itself constantly fell into their fundamental errors. The source of this confusion is to be found in the ambiguity of the interpretation given to the following thesis of the Revolutionaries program. We consider that the most important phenomenon of Russian life, the one that will mainly determine the tasks, our italics, and the character of the publication activity of the Union, is the mass working class movement Revolutionaries italics, which has risen in recent years. That the mass movement is a most important phenomenon is a fact not to be disputed. But the crux of the matter is, how is one to understand the statement that the mass working class movement will determine the tasks? It may be interpreted in one of two ways. Either it means owing to the spontaneity of this movement, i.e., reducing a role of social democracy to mere subservience to the working class movement as such, the interpretation of Revolutionaries, the self-emancipation group, and other economists, or it means that the mass movement places before us new theoretical, political, and organizational tasks, far more complicated than those that might have satisfied us in the period before the rise of the mass movement. Revolutionaries incline and still inclines towards the first interpretation, for it has said nothing definite about any new tasks, but has argued constantly as though the mass movement relieves us of the necessity of clearly understanding and fulfilling the tasks it sets before us. We need only point out that Revolutionaries considered that it was impossible to set the overthrow of the autocracy as the first task of the mass working class movement, and that it degraded this task in the name of the mass movement to that of a struggle for immediate political demands. Reply. Page 25. We shall pass over the article by B. Krichevsky, editor of Revolutionaries, entitled The Economic and the Political Struggle in the Russian Movement, published in number 7 of that paper, in which these very mistakes footnote 20 are repeated, and proceed directly to Rebecca Diallo, number 10. We shall not, of course, enter in detail into the various objections raised by Krzyzewski and Martino against Soroyan and Iskra. We are here interested solely in the basis of principles on which Rebecca Diallo, in its 10th issue, took its stand. Thus, we shall not examine the strange fact that Rebecca Diallo saw a diametrical contradiction between the proposition social democracy does not tie its hands, it does not restrict its activities to some one preconceived plan or method of political struggle, it recognizes all means of struggle as long as they correspond to the forces at the disposal of the party, etc. Iskra, number 1 footnote 21. And the proposition without a strong organization skilled in waging political struggle under all circumstances and at all times, there can be no question of that systematic plan of action, illumined by firm principles and steadfastly carried out, which alone is worthy of the name of tactics. Iskra, number 4. Footnote 22. To confound recognition, in principle, of all means of struggle, of all plans and methods, provided they are expedient, with the demand at a given political moment to be guided by a strictly observed plan is tantamount, if we are to talk of tactics, to confounding the recognition by medical science of various methods of treating diseases with the necessity for adopting a certain definite method of treatment for a given disease. The point is, however, that Rebecca Diallo, itself the victim of a disease which we have called owing to spontaneity, refuses to recognize any method of treatment for that disease. Hence, it has made the remarkable discovery that tactics as plan contradicts the fundamental spirit of Marxism. Number 10, page 18, that tactics are a process of growth of party tasks, which grow together with the party. Page 11. Rebecca Diallo's italics. This remark has every chance of becoming a celebrated maxim, a permanent monument to the Rebecca Diallo trend. To the question, whether the leading organ replies movement is a process of changing the distance between the starting point and subsequent points of the movement. This matchless example of profundity is not merely a curiosity were it that it would not be worth dealing with at length, but the program of a whole trend, the very program which R.M. in the separate supplement to Rebecca's missal expressed in the words that struggle is desirable which is possible, and the struggle which is possible is that which is going on at the given moment. This is precisely the trend of unbounded opportunism, which passively adapts itself to spontaneity. Tactics as plan contradicts the essence of Marxism. But this is a slander of Marxism. It means turning Marxism into the caricature held up by the Narodniks in their struggle against us. It means belittling the initiative and energy of class-conscious fighters, whereas Marxism, on the contrary, gives a gigantic impetus to the initiative and energy of the social democrat, opens up for him the widest perspectives, and if one may so express it places at his disposal the mighty force of many millions of workers spontaneously rising for the struggle. The entire history of international social democracy teems with plans advanced now by one, now by another political leader, some confirming the far-sightedness and the correct political and organizational views of their authors and others revealing their short-sightedness and their political errors. At the time when Germany was at one of the crucial turning points in its history, the formation of the empire, the opening of the Reichstag, and the granting of universal suffrage, Liebknecht had one plan for social democratic politics and work in general, and Schweitzer had another. When the anti-socialist law came down on the heads of the German socialists, Most and Hesselmann had one plan. They were prepared then and there to call for violence and terror. Huchberg, Scram, and partly Bernstein had another. They began to preach to the Social Democrats that they themselves had provoked the enactment of the law by being unreasonably bitter and revolutionary, and must now earn forgiveness by their exemplary conduct. There was yet a third plan, proposed by those who prepared and carried out the publication of an illegal organ. It is easy, of course, with hindsight, many years after the struggle over the selection of the path to be followed, and after history has pronounced its verdict as to the expediency of the path selected, to utter profound maxims about the growth of party tasks, which grow together with the party. But at a time of confusion, Footnote 23, when the Russian critics and economists are degrading social democracy to the level of trade unionism, and when the terrorists are strongly advocating the adoption of tactics as plan that repeats the old mistakes, at such a time, to confine oneself to profundities of this kind means simply to issue to oneself a certificate of poverty. At a time when many Russian Social Democrats suffer from a lack of initiative and energy, from an inadequate scope of political propaganda, agitation, and organization. Footnote 24, from a lack of plans for a broader organization of revolutionary work, at such a time, to declare that tactics as plan contradicts the essence of Marxism means not only to vulgarize Marxism in the realm of theory, but to drag the party backward in practice. Rebecca Diallo goes on to sermonize the task of the revolutionary social democrat is only to accelerate objective development by his conscious work, not to obviate it or substitute his own subjective plans for this development. Iskra knows all this in theory, but the enormous importance which Marxism justly attaches to conscious revolutionary work causes it in practice, owing to its doctrinaire view of tactics, to belittle the significance of the objective for the spontaneous element of development. Page 18. Another example of the extraordinary theoretical confusion worthy of Mr. V. and his fraternity. We would ask our philosopher, how may a designer of subjective plans belittle objective development? Obviously by losing sight of the fact that this objective development creates or strengthens, destroys or weakens certain classes, strata, or groups, certain nations or groups of nations, etc., and in this way serves to determine a given international political alignment of forces, or the position adopted by revolutionary parties, etc. If the designer of plans did that, his guilt would not be that he belittled the spontaneous element, but, on the contrary, that he belittled the conscious element, for he would then show that he lacked the consciousness properly to understand objective development. Hence, the very talk of estimating the relative significance Rebecca Diallo's italics of spontaneity and consciousness itself reveals a complete lack of consciousness. If certain spontaneous elements of development can be grasped at all by human understanding, then an incorrect estimation of them will be tantamount to belittling the conscious element. But if they cannot be grasped, then we do not know them, and therefore cannot speak of them. What then is Krzyzewski discussing? If he thinks that Iskra's subjective plans are erroneous as he in fact declares them to be, he should have shown what objective facts they ignore, and only then charged Iskra with lacking political consciousness for ignoring them, with belittling the conscious element, to use his own words. If, however, displeased with subjective plans, he can bring forward no argument other than that of belittling the spontaneous element, he merely shows one that, theoretically, he understands Marxism. Lokariev and Mikhailovsky, who have been sufficiently ridiculed by Belto, footnote 36, and to that, practically, he is quite satisfied with the spontaneous elements of development that have drawn our legal Marxists towards Bernsteinism and our social democrats towards economism. and that he is full of wrath against those who have determined at all costs to divert Russian social democracy from the path of spontaneous development. Further, there follow things that are positively droll. Just as human beings will reproduce in the old-fashioned way despite all the discoveries of natural science, so the birth of a new social order will come about, in the future too, mainly as a result of elemental outbursts, despite all the discoveries of social science and the increase in the number of conscious fighters. Page 19. Just as our grandfathers in their old-fashioned wisdom used to say, anyone can bring children into the world, so today the modern socialists a la Nazis to love footnote 37 say in their wisdom, anyone can participate in the spontaneous birth of a new social order. We too hold that anyone can. All that is required for participation of that kind is to yield to economism when economism reigns and to terrorism when terrorism arises. Thus, in the spring of this year, when it was so important to utter a note of warning against infatuation with terrorism, Revolutionaries stood in amazement, confronted by a problem that was new to it. And now, 6 months after, when the problem has become less topical, it presents us at one and the same time with a declaration we think that it is not and should not be the task of social democracy to counteract the rise of terroristic sentiments. Revolutionaries, Note 10, page 23, and with the conference resolution the conference regards systematic and aggressive terror as being inopportune to conferences. Page 18. How beautifully clear and coherent this is! Not to counteract, but to declare inopportune, and to declare it in such a way that unsystematic and defensive terror does not come within the scope of the resolution. It must be admitted that such a resolution is extremely safe and is fully insured against error, just as a man who talks, but says nothing, insures himself against error. All that is needed to frame such a resolution is an ability to keep at the tail end of the movement. When Iskra ridiculed Revolutionaries for declaring the question of terror to be new, footnote 25, the latter angrily accused Iskra of having the incredible effrontery to impose upon the party organization solutions of tactical questions proposed by a group of emigrant writers more than 15 years ago. Page 24. Effrontery, indeed, and what an overestimation of the conscious element, first to resolve questions theoretically beforehand, and then to try to convince the organization, the party, and the masses of the correctness of this solution. Footnote 26. How much better it would be to repeat the elements and, without imposing anything upon anybody, swing with every turn whether in the direction of economism or in the direction of terrorism. Revolutionaries even generalizes this great precept of worldly wisdom and accuses Iskra and Soryan of setting up their program against the movement, like a spirit hovering over in a formless chaos. Page 29. But what else is the function of social democracy if not to be a spirit that not only hovers over the spontaneous movement, but also raises this movement to the level of its program? Surely, it is not its function to drag at the tail of the movement. At best, this would be of no service to the movement; at worst, it would be exceedingly harmful. Revolutionaries, however, not only follows this tactics as process, but elevates it to a principle, so that it would be more correct to describe its tendency not as opportunism, but as tailism from the word tail. And it must be admitted that those who are determined always to follow behind the movement and be its tail are absolutely and forever guaranteed against belittling the spontaneous element of development. And so, we have become convinced that the fundamental error committed by the new trend in Russian social democracy is its bowing to spontaneity and its failure to understand that the spontaneity of the masses demands a high degree of consciousness from us social democrats. The greater the spontaneous upsurge of the masses and the more widespread the movement, the more rapid, incomparably so, the demand for greater consciousness in the theoretical, political and organizational work of social democracy. The spontaneous upsurge of the masses in Russia proceeded and continues with such rapidity that the young Social Democrats proved unprepared to meet these gigantic tasks. This unpreparedness is our common misfortune, the misfortune of all Russian Social Democrats. The upsurge of the masses proceeded and spread with uninterrupted continuity. It not only continued in the places where it began, but spread to new localities and to new strata of the population under the influence of the working class movement. There was a renewed ferment among the student youth, among the intellectuals generally, and even among the peasantry. Revolutionaries, however, lagged behind this upsurge, both in their theories and in their activity. They failed to establish a constant and continuous organization capable of leading the whole movement. In Chapter I, we established that Revolutionaries belittled our theoretical tasks and that it spontaneously repeated the fashionable catchword freedom of criticism. Those who repeated this catchword lacked the consciousness to understand that the positions of the opportunist critics and those of the revolutionaries in Germany and in Russia are diametrically opposed. In the following chapters, we shall show how this owing to spontaneity found expression in the sphere of the political tasks and in the organizational work of social democracy. Notes 1 Revolutionaries, number September 10, 1901, pages 17 to 18. Revolutionaries italics. Lenin to trade unionism does not exclude politics altogether, as some imagine. Trade unions have always conducted some political but not social democratic agitation and struggle. We shall deal with the difference between trade union politics and social democratic politics in the next chapter. Lenin 3 died in eastern Siberia in 1899 from consumption, which he contracted during solitary confinement in prison prior to his banishment. That is why we considered it possible to publish the above information, the authenticity of which we guarantee, for it comes from persons who were closely and directly acquainted with Lenin. Lenin for see present edition, Volume 2, pages 87 to 92. Said 5. In adopting the hostile attitude towards the activities of the Social Democrats of the late 90s, Iskra ignores the absence at that time of conditions for any work other than the struggle for petty demands, declare the economists in their letter to Russian Social Democratic organs Iskra number 12. The facts given above show that the assertion about absence of conditions is diametrically opposed to the truth. Not only at the end, but even in the mid-90s, all the conditions existed for other work. Besides the struggle for petty demands, all the conditions except adequate training of leaders. Instead of frankly admitting that we, the ideologists, the leaders, lacked sufficient training, the economists seek to shift the blame entirely upon the absence of conditions, upon the effect of material environment that determines the road from which no ideologist will be able to divert the movement. What is this but slavish cringing before spontaneity? What but the infatuation of the ideologists with their own shortcomings? Lenin 6. It should be stated in passing that the praise of Revolutionarism in November 1898, when economism had become fully defined, especially abroad, emanated from the self-same V.I., who very soon after became one of the editors of Revolutionaries. And yet Revolutionaries denied that there were two trends in Russian social democracy, and continues to deny it to this day. Lenin 7. Tsarist gendarmes wore blue uniforms. Tr. 8. That this simile is a correct one is shown by the following characteristic fact. When, after the arrest of the Decembrists, the news spread among the workers of the Schlüsselburg highway that the discovery and arrest were facilitated by an agent provocateur, then N. Mikhailov, a dentist, who had been in contact with a group associated with the Decembrists. The workers were so enraged that they decided to kill him. Lenin 9. These quotations are taken from the same leading article in the first number of Revolutionaries Missile. One can judge from this the degree of theoretical training possessed by these VVs of Russian social democracy. 38. Who kept repeating the crude vulgarization of economic materialism at a time when the Marxists were carrying on a literary war against the real Mr. VVs, who had long ago been dubbed the past masters of reactionary deeds for holding similar views on the relations between politics and economics. Lenin 10. The Germans even have a special expression, Nerdgewerkschaftler, which means an advocate of the pure trade union struggle. Lenin 11. Note this footnote has been moved into the body of the document. 12. Letter of the Economist, in Iskra, number 12. Lenin 13. Rebecca Dialogue, number 10. Lenin 14. Neue Zeit, 1901-02, XX, I, number 3, page 79. The committee's draft to which Kautsky refers was adopted by the Vienna Congress at the end of last year in a slightly amended form. Lenin 15. Note this footnote has been moved into the body of the document. 16. Note this footnote has been moved into the body of the document. 17. Present tasks and tactics of the Russian Social Democracy, Geneva, 1898. 2 letters to Rebecca Gazeta, written in 1897. Lenin 18c. Present edition, Volume 2, pages 323-51. Agitation 19. In defending its first untruth we do not know to which young comrades Axelrod referred, Rebecca Diallo added a second, when it wrote in its reply: since the review of the tasks was published, tendencies have arisen, or become more or less clearly defined, among certain Russian Social Democrats, towards economic one-sidedness, which represent a step backwards from the state of our movement as described in the tasks page 9. This, in the reply, published in 1900, but the first issue of Rebecca Diallo containing the review appeared in April 1899. Did economism really arise only in 1899? No. The year 1899 saw the first protest of the Russian Social Democrats against economism, the protest against the credo. Economism arose in 1897, as Rebecca Diallo very well knows, for already in November 1898, VI was praising Rebecca Misselsi Listokrabetnikar, number 9-10. Lenin 20. The stages theory, or the theory of timid zigzags, in the political struggle is expressed, for example, in this article, in the following way: political demands, which in their character are common to the whole of Russia, should, however, at first this was written in August 1900, correspond to the experience gained by the given stratum 6 of workers in the economic struggle. Only on the basis of this experience can and should political agitation be taken up, etc. Page 11. On page 4, the author, protesting against what he regards as the absolutely unfounded charge of economist heresy, pathetically exclaims: what social democrat does not know that according to the theories of Marx and Engels the economic interests of certain classes play a decisive role in history, and, consequently, that particularly the proletariat's struggle for its economic interests must be of paramount importance in its class development and struggle for emancipation. Our italics. The word consequently is completely irrelevant. The fact that economic interests play a decisive role does not in the least imply that the economic, i.e., trade union struggle is of prime importance. For the most essential, the decisive interests of classes can be satisfied only by radical political changes in general. In particular, the fundamental economic interests of the proletariat can be satisfied only by a political revolution that will replace the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie by the dictatorship of the proletariat. Krzyzewski repeats the arguments of the VV.S of Russian social democracy, viz. that politics follows economics, etc., and of the Bernsteinians of German social democracy, e.g. By similar arguments Waltman sought to prove that the workers must first of all acquire economic power before they can think about political revolution. Lenin 21c present edition, Volume 4, pages 370-71. Education 22c present edition, Volume 5, page 18. Education 23 Ein Jahr der Verwirrung, A Year of Confusion is the title Mehring gave to the chapters of his History of German Social Democracy, in which he describes the hesitancy and lack of determination displayed at first by the socialists in selecting the tactics as plan for the new situation. Lenin 24 leading article in Iskra, number 1. See Collected Works, Volume 4. Page 369. Education Lenin 25. See Collected Works, Volume 5, pages 18-20. Education 26. Nor must it be forgotten that in solving theoretically the problem of terror, the emancipation of labor group generalized the experience of the antecedent revolutionary movement. Lenin 27. The pamphlet on agitation was written by A. Creamer, later an organizer of the Bund, and edited by Y0. Cederbaut Marteau in Footnote in 1894. It was at first circulated in handwritten and hectographed copies, but at the end of 1897 it was printed in Geneva and supplied with a preface and concluding piece by P.B. Axelrod. The pamphlet summarized the experiences gained in social democratic work in Footnote and exerted a great influence on Russian social democrats, since it called on them to reject narrow study circle propaganda and to go over to mass agitation among the workers on issues of their everyday needs and demands. It exaggerated a role of the purely economic struggle, however, to the detriment of political agitation on issues of general democratic demands, and was the embryo of the future economism. P.B. Axelrod not at the one-sidedness of the Vilno economism in his concluding piece to the Geneva edition. G.V. Plekhanov made a critical analysis of the pamphlet on agitation in his Once More on Socialism and the Political Struggle. 28 Ruskaya Starna, the Russian Antiquarian monthly magazine dealing with historical problems, published in St. Petersburg from 1870 to 1918. 29 S. Petersburgsky Rabiki Listok Street. Petersburg Workers' Paper, an illegal newspaper, organ of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class. 2 issues appeared. Number 1 in February 1897, dated January, and mimeographed in Russia in an edition of 300 copies, and number 2 in September 1897 in Geneva. 30. A private meeting referred to here was held in St. Petersburg between February 14 and February 17, 26, and March 1, 1897. It was attended by V.I. Lenin, A.A. Heavy, G.M.K. Rozhachnovsky, and other members of the St. Petersburg League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class, that is, by the veterans who had been released from prison for 3 days before being sent into exile to Siberia, as well as by the young leaders of the League of Struggle who had taken over the leadership of the League after Lenin's arrest in December 1895. 31. Listok Rabotnika, the working man's paper published in Geneva by the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad from 1896 to 1899. Altogether there appeared 10 issues. Issues 1-8 were edited by the Emancipation of Labor Group. But after the majority of the Union Abroad went over to economism, the Emancipation of Labor Group refused to continue editing the paper. NOS 9 and 10 were issued by a new editorial board set up by the Union of Russian Social Democrats Abroad. 32 The article by V.I. and article by V.P. Vance Hint. 38 V.V. pseudonym of V.P. Vorontsov, an ideologist of liberal Marxism in the 80s and 90s of the 19th century. By the V.V.S. of Russian social democracy. Lenin understands the economists who represented the opportunist trend in the Russian social democratic movement. 33 The Hirsch-Dunziker unions were established in Germany in 1868 by Hirsch and Dunziker, two bourgeois liberals. They preached the harmony of class interests, drew the workers away from the revolutionary class struggle against the bourgeoisie, and restricted a role of the trade unions to that of mutual benefit societies and educational bodies. 34 The self-emancipation of the workers group. A small group of economists formed in St. Petersburg in the autumn of 1898. It existed for only a few months and published a manifesto setting forth its aims, published in Nakhanon on the Eve in London, a set of rules and several leaflets addressed to the workers. 35 Nakhanon on the Eve, a journal expressing Narodnik views. It was published in Russian in London from January 1899 to February 1902, altogether 37 issues. The journal was a rallying point for representatives of various petty bourgeois parties. 36 Grams V. Plekhanov published his well-known work The Development of the Monist View of History legally in St. Petersburg in 1895 under the pseudonym of N. Belto. 37 Narcissus Tuperlov. Narcissus Blunt Snout was the pseudonym under which Y.O. Martov published his satirical poem Hymn of the Contemporary Russian Socialist in Sortyan, number April 1, 1901. The hymn ridiculed the economists and their adaptations to spontaneous events.